The day Jennie Norris walked into the Marshal's office with dried mud on her boots and fire in her dark eyes, the town of Caldwell, Kansas had no idea that everything was about to change. Not for the town, and certainly not for the lonesome cowboy leaning against the post outside. It was the spring of 1878, and Caldwell sat on the southern edge of Kansas like a fraying hem on an old skirt, close enough to the Indian Territory border that trouble could ride in before breakfast and be gone before supper. The cattle trade brought money and men in equal and dangerous measure, and the dust that rose off the main street settled on everything: the storefronts, the horses, the shoulders of the good and the crooked alike. It was not a gentle town, but it had its moments of grace, and on this particular Tuesday morning in April, one of those moments was standing at a crossroads with her jaw set and her hands balled into fists at her sides. Jennie Norris was 28 years old. She had come to Caldwell 3 years ago as a new bride, following her husband Daniel Norris west from Missouri with a wagon full of hope and cast iron pans, and the particular kind of courage that women on the frontier carried so quietly that men often mistook it for mere stubbornness. Daniel had been a good man, a farmer who believed that the land south of Caldwell was rich enough to build something on, and for 2 years they had done exactly that. They had plowed, they had planted, they had struggled through one winter that nearly broke them and come out the other side laughing. Then Daniel had been thrown from a horse on a wet October morning, and Jennie had become a widow before she turned 27. She had not run back to Missouri. She had not sold the farm. She had hired a hand named Pedro, a quiet man of Mexican descent who knew soil the way a musician knows sound, and she had kept going. She had kept going because that was what she did, because Daniel would have wanted it, because the land was hers and she had bled for it just as much as any man ever had. So when Harlan Greer and his 2 sons began riding through her fence lines in the early weeks of April 1878, pulling up posts, letting their cattle trample her new wheat, Jennie did not simply sit down and weep. She walked into town. The new Marshal's office smelled like fresh-cut pine and boot polish, and Marshal Everett Cole was seated behind his desk like a man who had only recently discovered that sitting behind a desk was part of the job. He was perhaps 40 years old, solid and broad, with a reputation that had preceded him from Wichita where he had dealt, it was said, effectively with trail hands who drank too much. He wore his badge with obvious pride. He also, Jennie quickly discovered, wore his politics with equal visibility. "Mrs. Norris," he said, leaning back in his chair and folding his hands across his stomach in the way of a man who had already decided what his answer would be before she finished her sentence. "I understand your frustration." "My frustration," Jennie said, and her voice was level and precise, "is that Harlan Greer has torn down 14 fence posts on my eastern boundary in the last 2 weeks. His cattle have destroyed approximately 6 acres of early wheat. I want to file a formal complaint, and I want it documented so that there is a legal record." Marshal Cole's expression did not change in any meaningful way, but something behind his eyes shifted in the manner of a man consulting an internal ledger. Jennie had seen that look before. She had seen it on the faces of men who weighed things, not right and wrong, but advantage and disadvantage, risk and reward. "Mrs. Norris," he said again, and the repetition of her name was already beginning to feel like a door being gently but firmly closed. "Harlan Greer is one of the largest landholders in Sumner County. He's been in this territory 20 years. He has friends in the county seat, friends in the Cattle Association. Now, I'm not saying what he's done is right, I'm not saying that at all, but filing a formal complaint against a man like Harlan Greer is the kind of thing that what?" Jennie asked. "That can make life very complicated," Cole said, "for everyone involved, including you. You're a widow, Mrs. Norris, running a small farm on your own. Greer's a man who holds a lot of paper in this county, a lot of notes, a lot of mortgages. I would hate to see you. I am not asking you to fight my battles, Marshal," Jennie said, and now there was an edge in her voice, bright and clean as a new blade. I am asking you to do your job. I am asking you to take a complaint from a citizen of this county, write it down and file it. That is all." Cole spread his hands in a gesture of practiced helplessness. "I am sorry, Mrs. Norris, I truly am, but my hands are tied. A complaint of this nature against a man of Greer's standing would need to come with substantial evidence and backing, and without that I simply cannot, Jennie said softly. She let the words sit in the air between them like smoke. Then she straightened her spine, picked up her gloves from his desk where she had set them, and turned toward the door. "Then I will find someone who can." She stepped outside into the bright April morning and stood on the boardwalk for a moment, letting the hot knot of anger and humiliation in her chest dissolve into something cooler and more useful. The street was alive with its ordinary morning business. A freight wagon rolling slowly past, two women with market baskets crossing toward the dry goods store, a pair of cowhands on horseback heading south toward the cattle pens. And leaning against the post not 4 feet from where she stood, one shoulder against the wood, arms crossed, one boot heel hooked on the lowest board, was a man she did not recognize. He was perhaps 30 or 31, lean in the way of men who worked outdoors and ate irregularly, with broad shoulders that suggested strength rather than bulk. He wore a dusty trail coat the color of dark tobacco, and his hat was pushed back on his head in a manner that was either careless or deliberate. His hair was a deep brown, and his jaw was rough with several days of travel. He might have been simply resting, might have been entirely uninvested in anything around him, except that when Jennie looked at his face, she saw that he had been listening. His eyes were a particular shade of gray-green, like creek water in October, and they were looking at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. It was not pity. It was not the idle curiosity of a man with nothing better to do. There was something attentive in it, something that had been paying genuine attention. "Pardon me," Jennie said, because she nearly walked into him, and also because the situation called for something. "Pardon you for what?" he said. His voice was low and unhurried, with the faint trace of a Texas upbringing somewhere underneath it. "You didn't do anything wrong." Jennie looked at him more carefully. "Were you listening to that?" "The door was open," he said simply, and the marshal didn't bother to lower his voice. There was a pause. A horse whickered somewhere down the street. Jennie studied this man, his easy posture, the rifle sheathed on his saddle which was tied at the post behind him, the worn but well-maintained quality of his clothes, the steady way he returned her gaze without the usual awkwardness men showed when a woman looked at them directly. "I don't believe I know you," she said. "Hugh Chandler," he said, and he uncrossed his arms and touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was simple and genuine rather than performative. "Riding through, mostly." "Mostly," Jennie repeated. "I had been thinking about stopping a while," he said. "Looking for work. I've done some ranch hand work, some trail driving, a little bit of everything." He paused. "I also heard what that man said to you in there." "Then you heard him say he would not help me?" "Yes, ma'am," Hugh Chandler said. "I did hear that." He was quiet for a moment, watching her with those creekwater eyes. "I heard what you're dealing with, fence lines being torn up, cattle run through your wheat." He paused again. "I may not be a lawman, and I may not have a badge, but I know something about land rights, and I know something about the kind of men who think a widow won't push back." He looked at her steadily. "If you still need someone to help you file that complaint, or to back it up, or to stand on that land with you and make it clear you're not going away, I'll do it." Jennie stared at him. She had been in Caldwell long enough to know that strangers who offered help without a price attached were either rare or lying, and she had never been a woman who accepted charity gracefully, even when she needed it. She crossed her arms. "Why?" she said. "You don't know me. You don't know anything about my situation except what you heard through a door." Hugh Chandler was quiet for a moment. He looked down the street, then back at her. "Because what I heard through that door was a woman who had done everything right and was being told that it didn't matter," he said. "And I've seen enough of that to know it isn't right. That's all. No price attached. No expectations." Jennie Norris had survived a winter that broke fences and a grief that broke hearts, and the particular slow erosion of being a woman alone in a world that was not built for women alone, and she had done all of it without cracking. But something in the simple plainness of what this man said, the lack of performance in it, the absence of any angle, did something to the careful, controlled architecture of her composure. She did not crack. But something shifted, like a door opening inward rather than out. "My name is Jennie Norris," she said. "My farm is about 3 miles southeast of town, and I would appreciate the help." Hugh Chandler nodded once. "Then let me see to my horse and we can figure out where to start." They started at the county land office, because Jennie was a practical woman, and she understood that paperwork was a weapon. Perhaps the most important weapon available to someone who did not have Harlan Greer's political weight. The land office was run by a man named Elias Thorne, who was somewhere between 60 and ancient, who wore spectacles that sat crookedly on a nose that had been broken at least once, and who took his job with a seriousness bordering on the sacred. When Jennie came in with Hugh Chandler behind her and laid out her deed and her survey records and her plat map on his counter, Elias Thorne put on his spectacles and looked at everything with the gravity of a judge reviewing scripture. "Mrs. Norris," he said, after studying the documents for several minutes, "your boundary line here at the eastern edge is clear. There's no ambiguity. You hold this land to this point and Greer's property begins here." He tapped the map with a gnarled finger. "If he's pulled up posts inside your boundary, 14 posts," Jennie said, "and I still have the post holes as evidence. I measured them this morning before I came to town." Thorne looked at her over his spectacles. "You measured them?" "I did. I wrote it down." She produced a folded piece of paper from her coat pocket and laid it on the counter. Thorne unfolded it, read it, and nodded slowly. "You could file a civil complaint with the district court in Wellington," Thorne said. "That's the county seat. It would take some time, but with this documentation—" "How much time?" Hugh Chandler asked. It was the first time he had spoken since they entered the office, and both Thorne and Jennie looked at him. His voice was even, neither aggressive nor deferential, the voice of a man asking a practical question. 2-3 weeks to be heard," Thorne said, "depending on the judge's schedule. And in the meantime, Greer can keep running cattle through her fields," Hugh said. "Is there any provision for an immediate injunction? Something local before it goes to Wellington?" Thorne studied him. "You know something about the law, young man." "I know something about a lot of things," Hugh said, without particular vanity. "Enough to ask the question." Thorne removed his spectacles and polished them thoughtfully. "There's a justice of the peace in Caldwell, Judge Warren Holt. He's an old man and he doesn't like Harlan Greer much. They had a disagreement about grazing rights some years back. He has the authority to issue a temporary restraining order against trespass on documented private land." Thorne replaced his spectacles. "It's not commonly done. Most people don't know to ask for it." "But it can be done," Jennie said. "It can be done," Thorne confirmed. Hugh Chandler looked at Jennie and she looked at him, and something passed between them that was not yet words but was something, an alignment, a recognition, the first faint stitch of something being built. "Then that's what we do next," Jennie said. Judge Warren Holt was not in his office. He was in the back room of the Caldwell Hotel dining room, eating his lunch with the deliberate and unapologetic concentration of a man who considered midday meals a serious matter. He was perhaps 70 years old, short and compact, with a white beard trimmed neatly, and eyes the color of old pennies that were sharp and quick and missed nothing. When Jennie and Hugh came in and stood at the edge of his table, he looked up from his chicken and biscuits without alarm. "Mrs. Norris," he said in a tone of genuine recognition and warmth, "I heard about your wheat field, terrible business." "You heard about it," Jennie said. "Word travels in a small town," Holt said. "Sit down, please, both of you." He looked at Hugh with those penny-colored eyes. "You are?" "Hugh Chandler. I'm helping Mrs. Norris today." Holt absorbed this without commentary and returned his attention to Jennie. "What do you need from me?" Jennie laid the documents on the table, the deed, the plat map, her measurements of the post holes. the written account of the dates and extent of the damage. Holt did not touch his food again while he read. He went through each page with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who understood that the weight of a small piece of paper could bend the course of a life. When he finished, he straightened the pages and looked at her. "I can issue a temporary restraining order today," he said. "Greer and his sons are to cease all entry onto your property, cease all interference with your fence lines, and are to make no contact with you or your property until the matter is heard in Wellington. If they violate it, they face contempt proceedings." He paused. "I want to be honest with you, Mrs. Norris. Greer is going to be furious. He has more money than I have patience, and he is going to use every bit of it." "I know," Jennie said, "and you're still asking me." "I'm still asking you," she said. Holt looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Hugh Chandler. Then he picked up his biscuit, took a deliberate bite, chewed, and swallowed. "Give me an hour," he said. "Come back at 2 o'clock, and I'll have the order written and signed." Outside on the hotel's front steps, in the warm April air, Jennie let out a breath that she had been holding since approximately that morning. She put her hand briefly over her eyes, not to hide tears. There were no tears, but in the gesture of someone recalibrating, someone letting the pressure off. "Thank you," she said. She lowered her hand and looked at Hugh Chandler, who was leaning against the hotel railing with his arms loosely crossed, watching her with that particular attentiveness that she was already coming to recognize as simply his way of being present in the world. "I would not have known to ask for a restraining order. I would have gone back home empty-handed, and Greer would have known it." "You would have figured it out," Hugh said. "Maybe," she said, "but not today." She paused. "You know, you didn't have to do any of this. You said you were riding through." "I said I had been thinking about stopping a while," he corrected, gently. His mouth moved in what was not quite a smile but was in that direction. "I'm still thinking about it." Jennie Norris looked at this man, this Hugh Chandler who had appeared outside a Marshal's office on a Tuesday morning with no stake in her life whatsoever, and had simply chosen to act, and she felt something she had not felt since Daniel died. Not grief, which she felt all the time still in the background, the way you feel the cold through a window without always naming it. Something else, something quieter and more dangerous. Something that felt like the very early beginning of being known. She looked away before it showed too plainly in her face. "Do you have a place to stay?" she asked in a businesslike tone. "Not yet," Hugh said. "I was going to see about a room at one of the boarding houses." "There is a decent one on Cedar Street," she said. "Mrs. Clara Oakes runs it. Tell her I sent you. She's honest and her rates are fair." She paused. "And if you're looking for work while you're here, Pedro and I could use an extra hand. At least until this business with Greer is settled. The spring planting is behind because I've been spending time dealing with this instead of the fields." Hugh Chandler looked at her with those Creekwater eyes. "I don't expect pay for what I did today," he said very clearly. "I know you don't," Jennie said equally clearly. "I'm offering you a job, not a reward. They're different things." He looked at her for another moment. Then he gave a single nod, and this time the thing at the corner of his mouth was a full smile, brief and genuine, and it changed his face considerably. It made him look younger and warmer, and somewhat as if he had been waiting a long time for something he had not been able to name. "All right," he said. "That's a fair offer." They returned at 2 o'clock, and Judge Holt handed over a signed and witnessed restraining order with the calm efficiency of a man who had been waiting for someone to give him an excuse to do this particular thing for some time. He also, with the air of a man imparting a confidence, told Jennie that he had already dispatched his clerk to deliver a copy to Harlan Greer's ranch. "I wanted him to have it before sundown," Holt said, with a small, satisfied expression. "So there are no excuses about not receiving it in time." Jennie rode back to her farm that afternoon with the restraining order folded in her inside pocket, like a small piece of armor, and Hugh Chandler riding beside her on his bay horse. The ride was 3 miles of spring prairie, and the land was beautiful in that particular way, that the Kansas plains were beautiful, wide and unadorned, with the sky so large above it that it made you feel simultaneously small and freed from smallness. The wheat that had not been destroyed was coming in green and thin and hopeful. The smell of the earth after recent rain was still in the air. Pedro was in the barn when they arrived, a compact and steady man of perhaps 40 who looked at Hugh with the careful neutral assessment of someone who had learned not to make quick judgments about strangers, but who could read a person's quality from 10 feet away. Hugh dismounted, led his horse into the yard, and introduced himself in the direct and unaffected manner that seemed to be simply who he was. Pedro shook his hand, asked 2 quiet questions about horses, got 2 knowledgeable answers, and appeared to arrive at a provisional opinion. "Senora Norris works hard," Pedro said to Hugh, not unkindly but with a directness that was the diplomatic equivalent of a fence post. "This is her land, she built it." "I understand that," Hugh said with equal directness. "I'm here to help, not to manage." Pedro looked at him for another moment. Then he nodded once, the same kind of nod Hugh had given Jennie outside the hotel, economical and sincere. The farm itself was modest but well-kept, a timber-frame house with a covered porch, a solid barn, a chicken yard, a kitchen garden behind the house that was already showing the early green of the spring planting, a root cellar, a corral. It was the kind of place that spoke of intention and labor and care, of someone who had looked at a piece of raw land and imagined something specific, and then worked without complaint toward that image. Jennie showed Hugh the bunk in the barn, comfortable enough, with a good blanket and a window that let in the morning light, and gave him a brief tour of the work that needed doing. The fence posts were the most urgent matter. Over the next 2 days, Hugh and Pedro worked through the eastern boundary line, redigging post holes where they had been filled in, setting new posts, stringing new wire. It was hard physical work, the kind that required both strength and precision, and Hugh did it without complaint and without needing instruction, which Pedro observed and apparently found satisfactory. Jennie worked alongside them, because she always had, and she was not about to stop now. She was not delicate about it. She could set a post-hole digger as well as either of them, and she carried wire with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it for years. Hugh noticed this, as he noticed most things about her. She worked like someone who had made peace with the land's demands, not someone fighting against them. There was a rightness to her movements, a confidence that was entirely unself-conscious. On the second evening, after the work was done and Pedro had gone into the barn and Jennie had made coffee on the kitchen stove, she brought 2 cups out to the porch and sat in one of the 2 chairs there, and without asking or explaining, she set the second cup on the railing in a spot that was clearly meant for whoever else was present. Hugh came up from the yard, washed his hands at the pump, and came to the porch. He looked at the cup on the railing, and he looked at Jennie in her chair, and he sat down on the top porch step, which was close enough to be companionable and far enough to be uncrowded. The evening was warm and the sun was going down in colors that the Kansas sky performed extravagantly and without apology. "Tell me about where you came from," Jennie said. It was not a command or a formal invitation, just something said into the evening air, an opening. "Texas originally," Hugh said. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "East Texas. My father ran cattle, nothing like Greer's operation, smaller, family-run. I worked it from the time I could walk, basically." He paused. "I left at 19. Went up the Kishom Trail 3 times as a hand, then as a trail boss once. Did some ranch work in Colorado. Came through Kansas a few times." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't have a good reason for not having a place by now, except that the right place never quite appeared." "The right place," Jennie said, not with irony, just repeating it. "A place you could imagine staying," Hugh said. He looked out at the prairie in the evening light. "This is good land here," he added, and his voice carried a quiet respect that was clearly genuine. "Daniel thought so," Jennie said. She said it simply, without either performance or apology. "My husband, he picked this parcel himself. He said the soil was good and the water table was close enough to make it work." "He was right," Hugh said. "Yes," Jennie said. "He was right about a lot of things." She paused. "He died a year and a half ago, a fall from his horse. It was quick, which I suppose is something, though at the time it didn't feel like something. It felt like nothing, like everything stopping. Hugh was quiet for a moment. He did not offer the usual condolences, which Jennie had received enough of to have worn a groove in them. He said, "I'm sorry. That kind of loss leaves a shape in everything." Jennie looked at him. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly what it does." They sat in the evening quiet for a while, and the quiet was comfortable, which was its own kind of remarkable thing given that they had known each other less than 3 days. The trouble with Harlan Greer did not, as Jennie had expected, simply retreat in the face of the restraining order. Greer was a large man in every sense, physically large, large in his opinion of himself, large in his assumption that the law was a tool for people like him rather than a constraint upon them. He did not ride through her fence lines again, at least not personally and not immediately, but he began other forms of pressure that were technically within the bounds of the order, but were designed to make Jennie's life difficult. He spoke to the man who ran the grain exchange in Caldwell, and suddenly Jennie found that the price she was offered for her wheat had dropped significantly from what it had been the previous year. He spoke to someone at the hardware store, and a particular order of Jennie's iron wire and hardware for the fence repairs was mysteriously delayed. And one afternoon, 2 of Greer's cowboys rode slowly back and forth on the public road that ran along the edge of Jennie's property for the better part of an hour, doing nothing illegal but making their presence obvious. Hugh watched all of this with a steadiness that was not passivity, but rather the calm of a man thinking. On the 4th day, when the grain exchange business became clear, he rode into town with Jennie and stood beside her while she spoke to the grain merchant, a man named Fowler who had the uncomfortable look of someone who knows he is doing something wrong and has decided to do it anyway. "Mr. Fowler," Hugh said, after Fowler had given Jennie the reduced offer with an apologetic shrug that convinced no one, "I'm curious about something. I understand that prices fluctuate. But Mrs. Norris was offered a fair price last September for the same grade of wheat, and I'm wondering whether that price changed because of market forces or because of a conversation that happened recently." He paused. "I ask because if it's the latter, that's something a judge would likely find interesting." Fowler's expression tightened and then loosened and then went through several other configurations. "I don't know what you're implying," he said. "I'm not implying anything," Hugh said pleasantly. "I'm asking a direct question." The grain exchange ended up offering Jennie a price that was somewhat better than the reduced figure, though not as high as the previous years. It was not a complete victory, but it was movement. On the way back out to the farm that afternoon, Jennie rode beside Hugh in the spring warmth and said, "You know how to talk to people." "I know how to find what they're actually worried about," Hugh said. "Fowler's worried about being caught in something. That's always more useful than anger." "You're not angry?" Jennie asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I am," he said, "but I find it's better to keep it where it's useful rather than letting it run the show." Jennie looked at him with the sideways attention she had developed for watching him when she could do so without it becoming obvious. There was something about Hugh Chandler that she found herself thinking about more than was strictly sensible. Not just the practical competence of him, though that was real and considerable, but the quality of his attention, the way he listened when she spoke, not waiting for his turn to talk but actually listening, the way you could see it in his face, the way he remembered things she mentioned once in passing and referenced them days later, the way he treated her as the primary person in her own story, which sounds like a small thing and is not. She had been lonely. She would not have admitted it, not directly, but she had been lonely in the way that is different from being alone. She was competent at being alone. She had learned to manage the practical and emotional weight of it, but lonely in the sense of missing the particular warmth of being genuinely known by someone. Daniel had known her. And then he was gone, and there was a cold space where that had been, and she had grown accustomed to the cold because the alternative to growing accustomed to it was to let it rule her. But Hugh Chandler, in the space of less than a week, had begun to do something to the edges of that cold space. She noticed it and distrusted it in equal measure. One evening near the end of the first week, she found him in the barn after supper, sitting on a hay bale with a book. She had not expected a book. She stopped in the barn doorway, holding a lantern she had been bringing to hang on the post outside, and he looked up. "What are you reading?" she asked. He held it up so she could see the spine. It was a collection of essays by Ralph Waldo Emerson, worn to softness at the corners. "I didn't expect that," she said. "What did you expect?" She thought about it honestly. "I don't know, maybe a dime novel," he laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, and it was a good laugh, genuine and unguarded, a sound that appeared to surprise him slightly. "I do have one of those somewhere in my saddlebag," he admitted. "But Emerson is better company at the end of a long day." Jennie came into the barn and sat on a hay bale across from him, still holding her lantern. "My mother thought Emerson was dangerous," she said. "She said he encouraged too much self-reliance. She thought people needed community more than they needed philosophy." "She may not have been wrong," Hugh said. "They're not mutually exclusive, though." "No," Jennie agreed. And then, because the lantern light was warm and the barn smelled of hay and horses and the day's work, and because something in her had been building toward this anyway, she said, "Hugh, can I ask you something honest?" "Of course," he said. "Why did you stay?" she said. "You could have done what you offered, helped me for a day, helped me file the complaint and ridden on. You didn't have any obligation beyond that. But you're still here and you're fixing my fences and dealing with the grain merchant," and she stopped. "I'm not complaining. I want to be clear. I'm asking." Hugh looked at her across the lantern light. He was quiet for a long moment, not the silence of someone avoiding a question, but the silence of someone who is being careful about how they say the true thing. "Because when I rode into Caldwell, I had been on the trail for 3 weeks and I was tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix," he said. "And I stood outside that office and heard you talking to that Marshal, and the way you talked, the steadiness of you, the clarity, it woke something up that I hadn't felt in a long time." He paused. "And then you came out that door and you looked at me, and you didn't look through me or past me. You just looked at me, and I thought, I want to know what this person's story is. I want to know what she built and why." He looked down at the book in his hands. "I know that's not a short answer to a simple question." "It wasn't a simple question," Jennie said. He looked up at her. The lantern made the shadows warm and deep. "I know I'm a stranger," he said. "I know you don't have reason to trust me beyond what I've shown you in a week." "You have shown me quite a lot in a week," Jennie said. "I'm not asking for anything," he said, quietly but clearly. "I want to say that plainly. I'm not here with any. I'm not trying to push my way into something that isn't mine." "I know," Jennie said, and she did know. That was part of what was so disorienting about it, that, for the first time in a long time, she was near someone whose intentions felt entirely clean. She stood up, carrying her lantern. "Good night, Hugh," she said. "Good night, Jennie," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name without the formality of her title, and they were both aware of it, and neither of them made anything of it. She walked back to the house in the dark, her lantern making a small warm circle around her feet, and she stood on the porch for a while in the cool April night, and listened to the prairie making its nighttime sounds, the insects, the distant call of something, the wind through the new wheat, and she let herself acknowledge, privately and carefully, that something was happening in her life that she had not anticipated and was not entirely sure how to hold. The court date in Wellington was set for the 2nd week of May. In the weeks between, the farm moved through its spring rhythm, planting, mending, the endless small repairs that a working farm demanded, and Hugh became part of that rhythm in the way that someone becomes part of a piece of music, not by replacing an existing note, but by filling a space that had been there all along. He was good with the animals, patient and unhurried with the horses, and sensible about the cattle, which were few on Jennie's operation, 3 cows and a pair of draft animals. He could fix machinery, which in 1878 meant the plow and the cultivator and the wagon, and he did it with the focused concentration of a man who liked understanding how things worked. He helped Pedro extend the kitchen garden and build a cold frame for starting plants, which Pedro had been wanting to do for 2 years and had not had time to manage alone. Jennie watched all of this, and she could not help but notice the particular quality of ease with which Hugh existed on this farm, as if it agreed with him somehow, as if the proportions of it fit something in him. She noticed it, and she tried not to read too much into it, but the evenings kept happening. After supper, when the day's work was done, Pedro usually retired early, and Jennie and Hugh ended up on the porch or at the kitchen table talking. They talked about everything farming and land rights and the cattle trade and the way Kansas was changing, but also books and the places they had been and what they thought about things. Hugh had opinions about things, genuine and considered ones, and he offered them without needing them to be agreed with. And he listened to Jennie's opinions with the kind of focused attention that made the person speaking feel that what they said mattered. He told her about the trail drives, the immensity of moving a herd north, the dust and the heat and the river crossings, the particular camaraderie of men who were together in a hard and necessary thing. He told her about a rancher in Colorado who had given him a month's work and tried to pay him half of what was agreed, and what he had done about it, gone to the local judge, presented his contract, been paid. He told her about his father's death 2 years ago, how the Texas farm had been sold and divided among his brothers, how he had taken his share and ridden north and had not been back. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "Texas." He thought about it. "I miss what it was," he said. "But what it was doesn't exist anymore. The ranch is gone, my father's gone. The version of it I miss was always only going to exist for a while." "Yes," Jennie said. "I understand that exactly." She told him about Missouri, about the life she and Daniel had built here, about the first winter when the snow came so hard they were stranded for 11 days, and she had read every book in the house twice, and Daniel had made a chest set from scraps of wood. She told him what it had been like to lose Daniel, not the surface of it, the practical nightmare of it, which she had described to people many times, but the interior of it, the way grief reorganized the architecture of a person, the way you had to learn a new geography of yourself. Hugh listened to all of it without trying to fix it or minimize it or redirect toward something more comfortable. On the 15th of April, which had been her wedding anniversary, Jennie went out to the wheat field alone in the early morning and stood there for a while. She did not know Hugh had noticed until she came back to the house and found that he had made coffee and left it on the stove and was gone, already out in the far field with Pedro, giving her the house and the morning to herself. She stood in the kitchen with the coffee cup in both hands and thought that this was the kind of thing a man did when he was paying attention in the deepest possible way. She also thought that she was falling in love with him. She sat down at the kitchen table with this knowledge and looked at it directly, which was the only way Jennie Norris had ever looked at difficult things. It was too soon, arguably. It was complicated by grief and by practicality, and by the fact that she did not know everything about this man, though what she knew she trusted more than she had trusted most things. It was complicated by the fact that she was a widow with a farm and a legal battle and 100 practical concerns that were more urgent than her heart. And it was complicated by the fact that she was not sure what Hugh felt, though she was not entirely sure that she was uncertain either. She sat with it for a while. Then she got up, finished her coffee, and went outside to work. That was always the answer on the hard days: work and the land and the forward motion of it. The hearing in Wellington on the 12th of May was preceded by a ride down on the morning of the 11th. Jennie, Hugh, and Pedro, all three, because Pedro had witnessed the fence destruction on 2 occasions, and his testimony was part of the case. They stayed at a boarding house in Wellington overnight, Jennie in one room and the men in another, and in the morning they presented themselves at the Sumner County Courthouse. Harlan Greer was already there with his attorney, a smooth-faced man from Wichita named Albright who wore his city suit like armor. Greer himself was a big man, perhaps 55, with the particular florid self-confidence of someone who had spent 20 years never being seriously challenged, and he looked at Jennie when she came in with the assessing and slightly contemptuous expression of a man who had already concluded the outcome. When he saw Hugh Chandler beside her, his eyes sharpened. The judge was a woman named, well, actually the judge was a man, as was the case in 1878 in Kansas with essentially no exceptions, named Judge Ambrose Porter, who was thin and methodical, and listened to both sides with the careful neutrality of someone who actually intended to reach a correct conclusion rather than a convenient one. Jennie presented her deed, her survey records, her measurements, and her written account. Pedro testified. Hugh, who had examined the remaining post holes himself and made his own measurements, was allowed to speak as a corroborating witness. Albright tried several procedural challenges and a line of questioning designed to suggest that Jennie's measurements were unreliable, at which point Hugh produced his own measurements made with a surveyor's chain he had borrowed from Elias Thorne's office, which matched hers precisely. Albright shifted tactics and argued that Greer's cattle had been driven onto the land by a third party attempting to create a dispute, which was audacious and almost entirely without evidence. Judge Porter regarded Albright with the expression of a man who had heard a great deal in his time and was not particularly impressed by the range of it. Harlan Greer testified that there had been a historical grazing agreement between his land and the previous owner of Jennie's parcel. This was a more interesting argument. Jennie had not known about this claim. She looked at Hugh, who gave her a fractional nod that meant he was thinking about it. "Is this agreement documented?" Judge Porter asked. "It was a verbal agreement," Albright said smoothly. "Common practice in informal land arrangements of the period." "I would like to ask Mr. Greer directly," the judge said. "Mr. Greer, when was this verbal agreement made?" "With the man who sold the property to Norris," Greer said. "Fellow named Crawford. Said I could graze my south herd through the eastern section during spring and fall movement." "Did Mrs. Norris's deed or bill of sale mention any such easement?" the judge asked. "No, Your Honor," Jennie said. "There is no mention of any such agreement in any of the documents I received." "An undocumented verbal agreement with a previous owner does not constitute a legal easement that transfers to a new owner," Judge Porter said, and his voice was not unkind, but it was utterly final. "Particularly when that new owner has no knowledge of and was given no notice of such an alleged agreement." The judgment was in Jennie's favor on every point. Greer was ordered to pay for the repair of the fence to be assessed at a value of $42, which Jennie had documented carefully. He was ordered to permanently cease any interference with her property lines. Greer's face went through a complex series of expressions while this was being read, none of them pleasant, but he was enough of a practical man to understand when a field had been lost. Albright immediately began murmuring about appeal, which Judge Porter acknowledged was Greer's prerogative, with an expression suggesting he did not feel threatened by the prospect. Outside the courthouse, in the Wellington spring sunshine, Jennie stood on the steps with her documents folded back into their folder and felt the particular lightness of a thing that has been resolved, not a euphoric lightness, but a deep structural one, like a beam settling correctly into its place. Pedro shook her hand and then, more unusually, embraced her briefly, patting her shoulder with the reserved warmth of someone for whom the gesture was significant. "Your husband would be proud," he said. "Thank you, Pedro," she said. "Truly." She looked at Hugh, who was standing a step below her, his hat in his hand, and she said, "Thank you." She said it with her whole self behind it. "None of this. I don't know what I would have done without you stepping in that day." "You would have found another way," he said, which was probably true, but she shook her head. "I would have found a way eventually," she said, "but you made it possible to fight back fast enough to matter. The wheat that's in the ground right now," she gestured generally toward the direction of home, "that's there because of you." Hugh was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hat in his hands and then at her. "Jennie," he said. And then he stopped, as if he had started a sentence without being entirely sure where it was going, which was unlike him. "What?" she said. He looked at her. "I don't know how to say this right," he said. So I'm just going to say it plainly and you can do whatever you think is right with it." He paused. "I have been on this farm for almost 5 weeks, and in that time I have been happier, more settled, more like myself than I have been in longer than I can account for. And it's not only the work, though the work is good. It's you." He held her gaze. "You are the most remarkable person I have met in a long time, and I know this is complicated, and I know there is grief and history, and 100 reasons why it's too soon or too complicated, and I am not asking you for anything today. But I wanted you to know that, because I think you should know it." Jennie Norris stood on the steps of the Sumner County Courthouse in Wellington, Kansas, in the May sunshine of 1878, and looked at Hugh Chandler looking at her, and everything in her that had been carefully contained and correctly structured and sensibly managed since Daniel died made one small, decisive movement toward him. "I know it," she said. "I know it because I feel it too." There was a pause. Pedro was standing at a diplomatic distance, looking at the sky with great concentration. Hugh put his hat back on. His face had done something that she was not sure she had seen on a face before, a kind of illumination, not performed but internal, a light coming on behind a window. "All right," he said. His voice was slightly rougher than usual. "All right." They rode back to the farm that afternoon, and the world looked somewhat different from how it had looked in the morning, which is always the peculiar physics of the beginning of a love. Nothing changes and everything changes, and the prairie you have ridden 100 times is suddenly particular in a way it was not before, each element of it noted and valued. They did not rush. That was the thing about Jennie and Hugh, they did not rush. What had happened between them had been growing with the quiet patience of something planted rather than something struck, and the people they were, both of them, were people who understood the difference between growing things and burning things, and valued growing things more. In the weeks that followed the Wellington hearing, the quality of their evenings changed in the way that a room changes when a window is opened, the same room, but with more air in it, more light. They talked more freely. He reached across the kitchen table to show her something in a book and left his hand near hers without pulling it back, and she did not move hers away. One evening, watching the sunset from the porch, she leaned her shoulder against his, and he put his arm around her shoulders with the quiet rightness of a thing that has been waiting for its correct moment, and they sat that way until the stars came out. He kissed her for the first time on the 23rd of May in the barn of all places, and it was undramatic and completely right. She had been examining a horse's foot, and he had been holding the lantern, and she stood up and turned and found him very close, and they looked at each other for a long moment. And then it was just the natural conclusion of all the looking, gentle and certain and very warm. Pedro pretended not to notice any of this, but he stopped leaving the kitchen promptly after supper and took to sitting outside in the evenings on the bench by the barn door, smoking his pipe and reading, which gave the porch and the kitchen a privacy they had not previously had. He would have been impossible to thank directly, so nobody tried. June arrived in a blaze of heat and the wheat came in, all of it, even the replanted sections where Greer's cattle had been, coming up strong and green and heading out into gold. Jennie hired 2 additional hands for the Harvest brothers named Frank and Will Doyle, good-natured young men from Ohio who did the work efficiently and ate enormous amounts, and Hugh drove the wagon with her to the grain exchange, where Fowler, in the aftermath of the Wellington judgment and the general understanding that Jennie Norris was not a woman to be pushed around, offered a price that was fair. Driving back in the evening with the wagon empty and the money counted, Jennie said, "I've been thinking." "About what?" Hugh said. "About what happens next," she said. He was quiet. They both knew what this conversation was heading toward, had been heading toward for weeks. "What do you want to happen next?" he asked. She looked at him. "What do you want?" she said. He pulled the wagon to a stop on the empty road with the summer evening all around them and the fireflies just beginning to come out at the edge of the prairie, which is one of the more spectacular of the things that June evenings in Kansas produce. He turned to face her on the wagon seat. "Jennie," he said, "I would like to stay here, not as a hand, as I want to be here with you permanently. I want to build something here. I want to be on this land and I want to be with you." He paused. "If you'll have me." The fireflies moved in the dark of the prairie edge. Above them the sky was deepening toward night and the first stars were appearing. Jennie looked at Hugh Chandler and thought of Daniel, because she always thought of Daniel at moments like this, not as a ghost or a complication but as a presence, a remembered love that did not compete with new love but simply was part of the landscape of who she was. She thought that Daniel had loved her well enough to want her to be happy, and that was the truest thing she knew about him. "Yes," she said, "I'll have you." Hugh Chandler reached over and took her hand, and held it, and the wagon sat on the road while the fireflies multiplied, and the stars came out above the Kansas plain. They were married on the first Saturday of September 1878, in Caldwell, in the small white church on the south end of town that had been built the previous year and still smelled of fresh lumber inside. It was not a grand wedding, because Jennie was practical, and because they both felt that grandness was beside the point. What mattered was the fact of it, the decision, the saying of it aloud in front of people who cared about them. Pedro was there, dressed in his Sunday coat with his hair combed, and his expression one of deep and private satisfaction. Judge Holt was there, because he had liked both of them from the start and felt a proprietary pleasure in the outcome. The Doyle brothers came and sat in the back pew looking scrubbed and slightly overwhelmed. Several of Jennie's neighbors came, women who had watched her manage the farm alone and were glad to see her not alone. Jennie wore a dress the color of sage. She had made it herself from fabric brought in from the dry goods store, simple and well cut, and her dark hair was pinned with 2 combs that had been her mother's. And she stood at the front of that small church with her flowers in one hand and her other hand in Hugh's, and she felt, in the precise and unmistakable way of true things, that she was standing in the right place. Hugh looked at her the entire time with the expression she had first noticed outside the marshal's office, that deep and attentive look that was neither expectation nor possession, but simply the look of someone who was paying complete attention, who considered the person in front of him worth every bit of it. The minister asked if they took each other, and they said yes, and there was a moment of stillness in the small church that felt to Jennie like something the world was holding in trust for them. Marshal Cole, who had not been invited but who appeared briefly in the doorway at the back of the church near the end of the ceremony, saw the 2 of them standing there, saw the evidence of the whole story in the way they stood together, and had the grace to look somewhat abashed before he quietly withdrew. Nobody paid him much attention. Harlan Greer did not appear at all. He was still present in Caldwell and on his ranch, still substantial and still powerful, but his particular campaign against Jennie's farm had ended with the Wellington judgment, and the restraining order and the county record of the proceeding meant that any further interference would have consequences he was not willing to pay. He had lost this particular field, and he was a practical man in the end, and practical men know when to redirect their energies elsewhere. The afternoon after the wedding, Hugh and Jennie rode out to their farm together, and she sat behind him on his bay horse with her arms around his waist and her chin near his shoulder, looking at the land as they rode through it, and she thought that it looked different again. Everything was the same, the house, the barn, the kitchen garden, the fence lines running to the east, but the quality of belonging to it was different. It had expanded. The farm had been hers and Daniel's and then just hers, and now it was hers and Hugh's, and it was fuller for that in a way that surprised her, because she had not known she was still waiting for it to be fuller. "Pedro is going to have an opinion about that cold frame," she said against Hugh's shoulder. "He always has opinions about the cold frame," Hugh said. "They are good opinions." "Yes," she said, "they are." They came into the yard and unsaddled the horse and turned him out, and Pedro was indeed in the kitchen garden, not at the cold frame but nearby, pretending to examine the squash. He looked up when they came in. "You are back," he said, which was unnecessary but appeared to be what he had decided to lead with. "We are back," Jennie confirmed. Pedro looked at them both for a moment, and then he said, in a tone that was as close to sentimental as he ever allowed himself, "Good," and turned back to the squash. The autumn of 1878 was a good one. The wheat money was in and the farm was solvent, more than solvent. It was genuinely stable for the first time since Daniel's death. Hugh began talking with Jennie about expanding, not aggressively, but thoughtfully. The parcel of land to the west of theirs was for sale, 160 acres that bordered a creek and would improve their water access and allow them to run a small cattle operation alongside the grain farming. They went over the numbers together at the kitchen table, by lamplight, for several evenings. Pedro contributed opinions about the soil quality of the western parcel with the thoroughness of a man who had clearly already investigated it. When Jennie pointed this out, he said, without apology, that good information was always worth having early. They made the offer in October and the offer was accepted. Hugh rode the new parcel on 3 consecutive mornings, walking the creek line and the fence possibilities, and the places where the soil was richest, and came back each time with measurements and notes that accumulated into a plan for the following spring's expansion. Jennie watched him do this and felt, in a particular interior way, the rightness of having chosen someone who understood that building a life was a long project requiring this kind of sustained and detailed attention. What she had not expected, and this was the thing about love, the way it kept surprising you in its particulars, was how funny he was. Not in a performing way, but in the way of someone who saw the absurdity in things clearly and named it quietly. Pedro, who was not a person who laughed easily, could be made to laugh by Hugh with reliable consistency, usually by means of observations about the cattle or the weather or the particular eccentricities of the town of Caldwell. Jennie laughed more in the autumn and winter of 1878 than she had in the previous 2 years combined, and she noticed this as a physical thing, a loosening in the chest that she had not known was tightened. By January of 1879, Jennie was fairly certain that she was expecting a child, and by February she was certain without question. She told Hugh on a cold morning, standing in the kitchen while he had his boots half on, and he looked up at her with one boot on and one boot off, and his expression went through approximately 4 distinct phases in about 2 seconds: surprise, certainty, joy, something soft and enormous that she could not quite name, and he stood up and crossed the room and held her for a long time without saying anything, which was exactly the right thing. "Are you all right?" he said eventually into her hair. "I am very well," she said. "I am very well indeed." Pedro, when told, contributed a comprehensive list of recommendations about diet and rest, and the management of a kitchen garden in summer heat that lasted for approximately 15 minutes, and contained specific and very good advice. When he finished, he shook both their hands and went back outside with the expression of a man who had successfully completed a difficult task. The winter passed in its Kansas way, hard and beautiful and interminable, and then suddenly over. The spring of 1879 came in cold and then warm, and the expanded farm began to show the shape of what it would become: more fence, more field, the new cattle on the western parcel, the creek running clear after the snowmelt. The kitchen garden extended to twice its previous size. The cold frame, which Pedro had been managing with increasing sophistication, produced seedlings that Pedro spoke about with a reverence reserved in most people for matters of faith. On the 17th of August 1879, Jennie and Hugh's son was born. He came into the world in the bedroom of the farmhouse, attended by Caldwell's doctor, a steady woman. Actually, no, a steady man, as most frontier doctors were named Dr. James Alcott, who had delivered perhaps 200 babies in his career and treated the matter with the calm competence of experience. Hugh sat outside the bedroom door for 4 hours in a state of controlled and barely controlled worry, and Pedro sat with him for the second 2 hours without being asked, and they did not talk much, but the company was exactly right. When Dr. Alcott opened the door and told Hugh he had a son, and that Jennie was well and asking for him. Hugh stood up so fast that he knocked his chair over and did not notice. The baby was named Daniel Hugh Chandler, which Jennie had decided on and told Hugh about 6 months ago, and which had done something to Hugh's face then that it did again now when he held his son for the first time, something of the particular expression of a person who is receiving something they did not know they had been waiting for. Jennie lay in the bed with the warmth of August coming through the window and the sound of the farm around her, and watched her husband hold their son, and thought that there was nothing in the world that she was missing. She had not forgotten Daniel Norris. She would never forget him. He lived in the name of the baby in Hugh's arms, in the fields that he had chosen and she had held in the shape of her own history. Love does not replace loss. That is not how the architecture works. It adds to it. It builds on the same ground, using the same soil, and grows toward the same sky. Hugh sat on the edge of the bed and put the baby in the crook of her arm and put his arm around her shoulders, and they sat in the August afternoon and looked at what they had made. Caldwell grew in the years that followed more settlers, more commerce, more of the complicated civilization that was pressing itself into the Kansas territory with the relentless energy of historical momentum. The cattle trade continued but began to shift as the railroad extended and the old trail routes changed. The town got a new marshal in 1880, a younger man named Breckenridge who was considerably more interested in doing his job correctly than his predecessor had been, and who, on one occasion, referred a dispute about farm boundaries to Jennie Chandler as someone who had dealt with exactly that kind of thing and prevailed. Jennie found this amusing and told Hugh about it over dinner, and Hugh laughed and said that she might consider running for judge, and she said that she considered enough things already. Thank you. And he said he knew, and that was one of the things he admired most about her. And Pedro looked up from his plate and said that the squash was excellent this year, which it was. Harlan Greer, as it turned out, overextended himself financially in 1880, having borrowed heavily to expand his operation in the wrong direction at the wrong time, and was forced to sell off a significant portion of his southern holdings. Jennie heard this news from Judge Holt, who delivered it over coffee at the hotel dining room with the contained satisfaction of a man who believes in the eventual coherence of justice. She did not celebrate, because she was not that kind of person, but she allowed herself to acknowledge it quietly, and then she went home to her farm. The western parcel proved its worth in the second year of their expanded operation, with the creek water improving both the summer grazing and the irrigation of a new section of kitchen garden that Pedro managed with increasing complexity and impressive results. The cattle, a small and carefully selected herd of shorthorns, were healthy and well managed, and Hugh took to the ranching side of things with the same quiet, thorough attention he brought to everything. By the spring of 1881, Daniel was walking determinedly and with great enthusiasm for going directly toward whatever seemed most dangerous, and Jennie was expecting again. The second child, born in October 1881, was a daughter, and they named her Clara, after Mrs. Oakes, who had given Hugh that first room on Cedar Street and who had remained a family friend, and also after the particular brightness of an October morning in Kansas, which is, if you have never seen it, something like the sky performing its highest capability. Clara was from the first moment both quieter and more watchful than her brother, a combination that made Pedro predict, with the air of someone drawing on extensive data, that she would be either a judge or a farmer, and that both would suit her. He was, over the years, not proven wrong on this point. The farm continued to grow, not in the aggressive way of ambition but in the organic way of a thing that is healthy and attended to. They added a second barn in 1882. They improved the house, a proper kitchen addition, an extra bedroom, a real porch with a roof. The fence lines were perfect, maintained with a thoroughness that was part practical pride and part memory, because neither Jennie nor Hugh ever entirely forgot what insufficient fence lines had cost. Pedro stayed. He had nowhere else he was going, and the Chandler farm was the best place he had ever worked, and the family was his family, though he would not have said it in those words. He did say it once, years later, to Jennie when she thanked him for something, and he said, "I do not help because I am paid. I help because this is my home too." And she said, "I know, Pedro, I have always known," and that was sufficient. Hugh became, over the years, a person whom people in Caldwell came to with problems, not because he had any official standing, but because he was known as someone who listened carefully and thought about things and gave advice that was practical and fair. He served briefly on a local water rights committee in 1883 that managed to resolve a dispute between 5 farms in the town's developing water supply, largely by the method of getting everyone in a room, listening to all sides without judgment, and proposing solutions that gave everyone enough of what they needed. Jennie attended the final meeting of this committee and listened to him work and thought, as she had thought many times and would go on thinking, that he was the best person she knew. She told him this on the way home from that meeting, riding in the wagon in the October evening with the children asleep in the back. "The best person you know," he said. "That's a high bar." "It's an accurate description," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You've known me for 5 years," he said. "You know all my faults." "I know most of them," she said. "Probably not all, but yes, including those." He looked at her. The moon was up and the road was clear and the sleeping children made small sounds in the back. "Then I hope I keep earning it," he said. "You do," she said, "every day." They rode on through the October night, and the farm waited for them at the end of the road, its windows making yellow light in the darkness, and all of it, the house, the barns, the fence lines running into the dark, the wheat already in and the new wheat already planned for spring, was theirs, earned and built and defended and real. There was a moment, in the early winter of 1883, when Jennie stood at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee and watched Hugh and Daniel and Pedro in the yard. Daniel was 4 and learning to help with the chickens, which he approached with the excessive seriousness of a small person given responsibility, and Clara sitting on the porch steps with a stick and a patch of dirt, engaged in some private enterprise that apparently required both. And the whole ordinary tableau of a working day on a Kansas farm. And she thought about the day she had walked into a Marshal's office in Caldwell in 1878, with dried mud on her boots and 14 fence posts torn from the ground and a complaint to file. She thought about being told no. She thought about the particular cold quality of being told that what was right could not be done, because the man in the wrong had more money and more friends than she had. She thought about stepping out that door into the April morning and finding a man she had never seen before leaning against a post with creekwater eyes and the willingness to simply act. She thought about how much of a life turned on such moments, the moments where the road forks and you cannot see past the fork, and you choose the direction that seems right, and you keep moving, and years later you are standing at a kitchen window in the early winter with a cup of coffee and the sound of your children in the yard and the particular warmth of a good life around you, and you can trace it back, if you want to that one moment, that one choice. That one lean against a post and the willingness to look up. She could trace it to Hugh. She could trace it to herself. The two of them had made this together from that Tuesday morning in April, from a complaint that needed to be filed and a marshal who would not and a cowboy who would. Hugh came in from the yard, stomping mud from his boots in the doorway, and found her at the window. He crossed to where she stood and looked at what she was looking at, the yard, the children, the clear winter sky, and then he looked at her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She turned and looked at him, this man who had given her 5 years of steady, attentive, unsentimental and deeply felt love, who had helped raise her wheat and her children and her fence lines with equal care, who read Emerson in barns and laughed at the right things and listened in the way that meant he was actually there. "The day we met," she said. He smiled. It was the same smile she had first seen outside the marshal's office, the brief, genuine one, only it was no longer brief anymore. It had become a permanent feature, showing up often and without warning and always at the right moment. "Outside the marshal's office," he said. "You were leaning against the post," she said. "You nearly walked into me," he said. "You had been listening," she said. "The door was open," he said. "You said you would help me," she said. "I said I would," he agreed. She took his hand, the one nearest her, and held it. "You have," she said, "every single day." Hugh Chandler looked at Jennie Chandler in their kitchen in the winter of 1883, with their children outside and their farm around them, and the whole built and defended and beloved life of them present in every object and beam and window of this house. And he said, "I intend to keep going." And he did. They both did, in the way of people who have found the thing worth going toward and go toward it every day, not with fanfare, not with the drama of sudden moments, but with the steady, daily, unrelenting, joyful choice of it. The farm in the end was a good and lasting thing. The fence lines held. The wheat grew and was harvested and grew again. The children grew and were remarkable people, Daniel taking to the land with the instinct of both of the fathers he had been given, one in name and one in presence, and Clara becoming, as Pedro had predicted, something between a judge and a farmer, sharp-minded and deeply rooted in equal measure. Pedro grew old on that farm with the contentment of a man in his right place, and the cold frame became, over the years, a source of vegetables of such quality that people in Caldwell spoke of it with a specific admiration. Jennie and Hugh grew old together, which is the final and most complete form of the story. They grew old in the way that people grow old when they have spent their years building something real together, with a closeness that has no gaps in it, no spaces where the year's weight has pulled them apart, but rather a closeness that deepens with time, that is enriched by time, that is made larger and more true by every season of shared work and shared loss and shared joy. There was a morning in the early spring of 1895 when they rode out together to look at the new planting, just the two of them, on horseback, as the sun came up over the Kansas prairie in its extravagant April way, and they rode side by side across the land they had built together, and the sky was the color of the beginning of everything. And Jennie Chandler looked at Hugh Chandler, and Hugh Chandler looked at Jennie Chandler. And there was between them the particular look of two people who have been looking at each other for 17 years and find that there is always more to see. Still thinking about stopping a while. She said, which she said sometimes when the mood took her, and which never failed to produce that particular smile. Still thinking, he said, still decided. The spring wheat was coming in thin and green and full of the year's best promise. The fence lines ran clean to the horizon. The farm was alive and well and theirs. And all of it had begun on a Tuesday morning in April 1878, with dried mud on a woman's boots and fire in her dark eyes and a door left open, and a man who heard what needed to be done and said simply, "If you still need help, I will do it." Which was, in the end, the only thing that needed to be said.